everyone, this is Afeera Firdous and you're watching Chaos Knowledge, where headlines meet depth and noise gives way to nuance. In today's episode, we are going to discuss geopolitics in the Middle East. But before all that, let me introduce my guest. We have with us Bashir Ali Abbas. Bashir is a senior research associate at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research in New Delhi. He is also a former visiting fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Bashir. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Afeera. It's a pleasure to be here.
Bashir, let's start our discussion with Syria. With the fall of Assad government, a dangerous vacuum has opened, and especially that is visible in the areas near Aswad. As Israel and Syria exchange fire, the regional minorities are navigating their own survival strategies. How might the power dynamics evolve between Druze and Bedouin communities, especially as outside players eye influence in that region? And how the regional countries, particularly Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, positioning themselves in this fragmented post-Assad Syria?
Right. So that really covers the entire gamut of the conflict. So I think what I'll do is start off with Syria domestically, right? Just two assumptions in the question, which have long been made by several experts and observers, including myself, immediately post the fall of the Assad government. And that was in December 2024. Following that, in the question, you sort of asserted that one, there's a power vacuum, and potentially how might Israel and Syria strike exchanges play out, right? The first thing is that that power vacuum never really took shape, right? What we got instead was spearheading a rebel offensive. You had a group which was the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was led by Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, who now goes by Ahmed al-Shara, which is actually his real name, and Jolani's was his nom de guerre. He is today the de facto president of Syria. When HTS took over Damascus in December, this group got rather fortunate by design rather than by luck to receive a lot of regional support that ensured that that very vacuum that all of us expected never really occurred, right? The second is Israel and Syria haven't really been exchanging strikes. It's been Israel that has been consistently attacking Syrian territories for about 6 to 7 months continuously, right? I think thus far Israel's conducted over 900 strikes in Syria. But to just unpack why this is happening, first is let's just take a snapshot of how Syria looked like in December alone, right? You had central rule from Damascus, but you had at least two peripheral forces that were tugging at the center, which constantly led everybody to raise fears about Syria's potential fragmentation. You had the Druze in the south and the Kurds in the northeast, right? Beyond the Euphrates, which is northeastern Syria, which is very oil rich. The Kurds, like in Iraq, like in Turkey, have always distinctly sought to protect their identity and their autonomy. So they've had a modus vivendi with Assad, a very uncomfortable one, but it existed. So the Kurds effectively ran an autonomous administration, which they called Rojava, in the northeast. They had an armed wing, or have rather, which is the Syrian Democratic Forces. In the south, the Druze have had their own, it's been myriad militias that have sort of operated on their own, sometimes together, but more often independently. When Al Shara took over in Damascus, in the last 6 months, there has been one priority to unite the country, to make sure that Damascus now takes advantage of Assad's fall, because Assad himself was a common enemy. Now that common enemy has been removed, there has been an active effort from all sides to ensure that Syria can be united. But it's easier said than done. When it comes to today's Syria, there has been a third group, just like you had two peripheral forces in the past. Now you have a third, which is the Alawite coastline, that has historically been a large support base for the former Assad regime, but was never really considered a tugging force because, well, they were on the same line, on the same ideology. Their politics was largely in line with Damascus under Assad, right? Today, Sharra's challenge is to assure your peripheral groups, which are largely composed of minorities, ethnic and religious, such as the Kurds and the Druze, of their rights and grant them protections. This has not fully panned out. In March, specifically, you had General Mazloum Kobani, or General Mazloum Abdi, however you wish to refer to him, the most prominent leader of the Kurds, arguably, who struck a deal with Sharra in March, saying that the Kurds are ready to unite with the Syrian army under a unified command, as long as a distinct identity for the Kurds, militarily and politically, is assured. This, at the time, was assumed would be given, right? However, we see that about just 2 months later, when the Syrian interim constitution comes out, the Syrian Arab Republic, the name is retained. There are no specific assurances for each minority community. You have the constitution now declaring Islamic jurisprudence to be the sole source of law, whereas in the older constitution, Islamic law was considered as one of the major sources, right? So naturally, as a result of that, despite agreements having taken place with all of these other ethnic minorities, especially the Druze, it broke down. Technically, the agreements remain in place, but these two groups, which is the Kurds and the Druze, continue to assert that their needs are not fully met. Now, coming to the Druze question specifically, the Kurds we can discuss more in detail later on as we go ahead. The Druze form a minority in Suwayda, in Dara, in Quneitra, but they are a large minority, I think about 500,000 odd. The Druze are also a minority in Israel, which is about 150,000. In Syria, the Druze and their main leaders, especially Hikmat al Hijri, have had one priority, which is self preservation. As a result of that motivation, people like Hikmat al Hijri and other Druze leaders have largely been guided by what works for them best at that point in time. So, across the last 10 years, you will find the same leaders at times take a very fervent pro Assad stance. But on the other hand, you will also find them uniting their militias to eventually fight the Assad government or simply show their support to rebels and protesters who are well demonstrating against Assad in Damascus, right? So, similarly, now that distrust continues with Damascus, except that the person sitting in Damascus has changed. That's all that has happened. So the Druze concerns remain. When it comes to Israel and Syria, we can talk about Israel's larger strategy later, but essentially, is the Israeli interest today is to ensure that the south of Syria remains demilitarized. Now, with fresh fighting that has broken out, or which broke out rather, the end of July for about a week, that fighting was between the Druze militias and the Sunni Bedouin militias who you referenced earlier. The Sunni Bedouin militias are not controlled by Damascus, but they are not opposed by Damascus either. The world and the region is basically looking at the degree to which Damascus can assert or rein in these Bedouin militias. There is a complicated relationship there because the Bedouins assert their role in fighting Assad forces in the past, so they naturally want some independence for themselves. And the Bedouin tribes have long conflicted with the Druze. In this case, the Druze have continued to fight with the Bedouin militias. In fact, I think fighting broke out again last night, right? But Damascus's main assertion is that Damascus is in control. The Israeli logic, however, is that the Druze card today presents another casus belli for Israel to step up its military actions in Damascus. So it's little more than a marriage of convenience, again, for the lack of a better phrase. Because the Druze in the south of in Syria are so scattered, it is difficult to ascertain that all Druze are in favor of an Israeli intervention because most estimates say that they are not. Because if you remember, there was an Israeli strike on the Syrian Ministry of Defense just a few weeks ago. When that happened, a lot of Druze leaders were accused of being, well, anti Syrian and against the goal and spirit of national unity. But the Druze have sort of asserted themselves against this assumption, saying that that is not the goal at all. The goal, just like the Kurds, remains that of securing rights for themselves. The Israeli variable in this equation is largely separate. It's only when we look at it, in a broad brush sense that it appears to be very neatly tied, but it isn't.
So, as we are already talking about Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, let's break down the strategic imperatives of these three heavyweights of the region. For Turkey, it's about border security and containing Kurdish forces, and they have gained a major success recently against these forces. For Israel, the target remains Iran and Hezbollah's entrenchment. For Saudis, it is balancing its ambitions for regional leadership with a cautious re entry into the Syrian affairs. So here is the real question: that will these competing interests drive the region further apart, or is there still room for some alignment in this chaos?
The best way to answer this question is to divide the categories, right? The first one is intention, the second one is capability. When you consider all of these states, because talking the future of the region is too big. What we can do is take Syria as a microcosm of what the region might look like in the future. When it comes to intentions, you have Israel, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, who are consolidated in their common objective of ensuring that the removal of Iranian influence in Syria is sustained. Historically, because of Iran's strong supply routes via Iraq and Syria to Hezbollah and Lebanon, has been a threat not just to Israel physically, but also to the Arab world intellectually, politically, and socially, because it ensures a dominance of forces like the Hezbollah within Lebanon. But now that route through Syria has been cut. For the Arabs, along with this, the larger interest of removing even the presence and the influence of of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran is a core interest. So, for all of these states, that interest is common and they agree on it. The principal difference, however, is in how you go about the measures you choose to meet or service the demands of that interest. Right? How do you ensure that Iranian influence is gone? For the Arabs, which is the Qataris, the Saudis, and the Emiratis, the answer is clear. You make sure that no matter what happens, the region as a whole, as a collective, pushes for Syrian unity and consolidation. And the only way to do that is to support Damascus in every way, economically, politically, and militarily. So I wouldn't even say that the Saudis are being cautious, not at all. Saudi Arabia and Qatar have jointly, completely helped Syria repay its debt to the World Bank of close to 15.5 or $16 million, right? The Saudis have pledged about over $6 billion in investment, right? The Qataris are now taking care of almost have committed to taking care of almost all of Syria's electricity needs, right? Meanwhile, the UAE today is helping Syria potentially develop the Tartus port, which has historically been a Russian naval base, right? So all of these three countries are not being cautious. Rather, they are making sure that their approach is not troubled. This trouble, right, again, for the lack of a better word, is no longer Iranian. For them, the trouble comes from the different approaches that the Turks maintain and the Israelis maintain. But even there, the difference with the Turkish strategy is less than the difference with the Israeli strategy. The Turks, compared to the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Qataris, have been far more directly engaged in Syria across the last 15 years, to the extent that several kilometers of northern Syria is almost directly under Turkish control. In fact, the HDS and Sharra himself are a huge reason why they were so successful in taking over Damascus so rapidly is because they have benefited from years of support from Turkey in how they govern parts of northern Syria, right? Especially Idlib. So Turkey has always, for Turkey, this is an issue that is relevant for national security and for national politics, which is why Turkey today is arguably the most influential agent in terms of how much control it has on Sharra's agency to shape things in Syria. So the Turks are a useful instrument. You can't do anything without the Turks. In fact, even when Trump met Ahmed al Sharra, who's a formerly designated Al Qaeda terrorist, Recep Tayyip Erdogan joined via teleconference to make sure that Turkey was in the room, right? But as I said, in terms of intention, the Turks remain aligned with the Arabs. Now, you could say that in terms of grand strategy, the Arabs wouldn't like the Turks to have, say, a lopsided say in Syria's future. But because of the common interest, I think that question is being sidelined, right, as to who will really be the primary hegemon in Syria. But before we get to that, in terms of Israel, of how Israel sees it, as I said, Israel also agrees that the removal of Iranian influence needs to be sustained in Syria. But the Israeli approach has been far more unilateral compared to other actors in the region. For Israel, there has always historically been a suspicion of these jihadist groups, right? Between Assad and these groups, for them both options were bad, but Assad's was the less bad choice, or rather the less worst choice, right? Now that these groups have taken over, if you also just an aside here, across the Israeli genocidal campaign in Gaza, the Assad regime never really made any proactive never really took any proactive measure to enhance or even platform Iranian actions against Israel or those by Iranian proxies, right? I think that's important to keep in mind that the Assad regime was sort of charting its own course with and focusing on its reunity within larger Arab institutions. Now that the Assad regime has gone, the Israeli approach is to ensure that southern Syria remains demilitarized. And there's a larger cover for the expansion of Israel's illegal occupation of not only the Golan Heights, but greater territories in Quneitra and potentially in Dara and Suwayda as well, right? Because for Israel, the onus of security, of ensuring its security, is on itself, right? Israel likes greater control and greater agency and greater say because the Israelis do not wish to take any risk whatsoever. Now, you could argue that the Israeli case is made stronger by Sharra's inability to rein in a lot of the other groups that are tugging at the center in Syria, which we discussed earlier, right? That is where a lot of all these states presently differ. Today, because you have armed fighting that's continuing, the Arab states have focused on continuing their economic engagement while lobbying for both the United States and Israel to sort of rein in Israel's military approach. Right? So far, they've not succeeded. Right after the ceasefire was brokered, Ahmed al Sharra publicly said that they are looking for a greater Turkish role in Syria's defense. This is anathema to Israel, but it's also an uncomfortable prospect for the Arabs. Because, as I said, for the Arabs, it is consolidation within Syria itself that is the best prospect for the future, rather than a Syria that is completely and wholly a Turkish proxy. Some people would argue that Syria is already becoming a Turkish proxy, but that's a debate that we can have later.
Yeah. So let's move to Saudi Arabia. In recent months, Riyadh has stunned observers by extending diplomatic gestures to both Iran and Israel. According to one source, Saudi Arabia refused US requests to send missile interceptors to Israel during the recent Middle East crisis with Iran. With Syria caught in the middle, what exactly does Saudi Arabia stand to gain or lose? And in your assessment, how far can Saudi Arabia stretch its balancing act between Israel and Iran?
If you wish to assess the trajectory of Saudi Arabia's priorities in the region, both in Syria and otherwise, both the Saudis and the Emiratis today compete in having one principal objective, which is economic diversification, especially to pivot away from their oil focused economy. Now, as a result of that larger objective, a functional result of that objective has been a focus away from conflict, right? Especially those that are ideological, right? So, because the Saudis have this priority, which is also based on a secure region that can help them garner more and more investments, especially from states like the United States and other Western capitals, regional security in the absence of conflict is a priority for the Emiratis and the Saudis. Right? That is very clear. As a result of this, naturally, today the Saudis want to de-link themselves from conflict anywhere in the region, whether between Israel and Gaza, whether in Yemen with the Houthis, whether between Israel and Iran directly. Right? I mean, in the months before October 7, 2023, we saw that the Saudis were slowly closing in on potential normalization with Israel. It was always going to be a very difficult prospect for the Saudis in the Arab world, especially because, well, they host Islam's holiest sites, so they're constantly wary of perception. But with Iran, their rapprochement was faster, it was deeper, and it has sustained itself because of that overarching objective, right? So much was the Saudi interest evident is that after more than a decade of fighting in Yemen, today the Saudis are focused on extricating themselves from that conflict. If you will remember that in late 2023 and early 2024, when the United States was putting together a maritime coalition to fight the Houthis in Yemen, the Saudis were advising restraint to Washington. That is a deep irony if you contrast it with what was happening just a few years ago, especially say in 2015, 2016, right? So that larger Saudi interest is clear. But if you keep that interest in mind, it then becomes even clearer that For the Saudis, conflict between Israel and Iran is bad. However, the way in which this conflict has played out is even worse because Israel today has shown a capacity to successfully target nuclear facilities. It doesn't matter that it's in Iran. You'll remember that about 6 years ago, the Houthis showed their own ability to directly strike Saudi and Emirati energy facilities, impacting oil production massively for at least 1 or 2 days. For the Saudis, this cannot happen again. With the Houthis and the Iranians, they have been successful in deterring them not through coercion but through incentives, as I said, by extricating themselves from the war. But with Israel today, with whatever Israel has done, their net apprehensions for the future only increases. Because let's not forget, just last year, the United Arab Emirates completed work on having all four of its reactors in the Barakah nuclear power plant for them to be fully operational. The Saudis still don't have a functioning nuclear power plant yet. In fact, that is one major variable in the equation for the future of even US Saudi relations. Right? But before even that happens, for the Emiratis as well, if this template that Israel has now set in the region by striking Iran directly, if that template is normalized, then the net insecurity for the Saudis only goes up. And that is a principal reason why the Saudis today realize that the locus of conflict, the locus from where conflict flows, remains Israel. Right? That does not necessarily mean that the Saudis are now in an unprecedented alliance with Iran. Right? I think the Saudi position is an approach that prioritizes autonomy over anything else and to make sure that they can lobby the United States to end conflict in all of these countries. Right? That is why you will remember that when Trump was in Saudi Arabia, he was feted to such a large extent, and he constantly kept mentioning MBS's name because he says that MBS has a vision for the region's future, right? So you could see that even within Israel's conflict in the Middle East, when the Hamas terror attack happened, the Arabs were very clear that they wouldn't allow any large scale militant pro Palestinian activism because they wish to stay away from this, right? But across last year, the Saudi position shifted because, along with the Qataris and the Egyptians, the Saudis realized that the Israelis will arguably breach any agreement that the region fights for with or without US support, right? That has been clear. By September, October, when you had the second joint OIC Arab League summit in Riyadh, just compare the outcome statement from that summit with the outcome statement from the first OIC Arab League statement after this conflict from December 2023. You will see that this second statement from late last year is much, much more vociferous and assertive in saying that Iran's sovereignty needs to be protected, right? That Israeli aggression should stop, that the conflict in Gaza is a genocide that Israel is responsible for. So that shift was already underway because, as I said, for the Saudis, that locus of conflict was becoming far more clearer, right? Naturally, then, the Saudis have made it clear by the time the 12-day war between Israel and Iran happened that they would stay out no matter what happens. Right. As a result of that, you could see that there was no active or even passive assistance to the Israeli attacks. You had rhetorical support for Iran, but no military support. At the very end, when Iran sort of symbolically ended the conflict by attacking Al Udeid and telegraphing its attack in advance and ensuring, I would argue that the Iranians sent more apologies than the number of missiles that they did towards Al Udeid than anything else, because the Iranians kept reiterating this is not a fight against our Qatari brothers and sisters, right? Because they know that the Arab states want to stay out. So there has been this new modus vivendi between the Iranians and the Arabs. But the rapprochement that began from, say, mid 2023 has only deepened. You know, about 5 years ago, the Iranian IRGC used to be accused of mining Arab ships, especially oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. Today, you have IRGC ships visiting Emirati ports, right? So it's very clear where the Arabs are going. So if you have this sort of larger lens in mind, then I think it becomes a little easier to understand why the Arabs stayed clear of what was happening and why a ceasefire has always been in their interest. And a ceasefire in Gaza today continues to be in their interest because, like in Syria, they also have economic plans for Palestine that they are ready and willing to implement, but are constantly derailed by both the volatility in the current Trump White House as well as the fact that Israel is not a negotiating partner that they have good history with, no matter the degree to which the Saudi Arabia was close to normalizing ties in the past. But I think I'll stop there.
Yeah. So, Bashir, you already mentioned consistent airstrikes, Israeli airstrikes in Syrian region, but I want your quick take on these strikes. That are they just tactical responses, or are we witnessing a shift in Israeli broader deterrence framework or strategy? And if Iran's footprints goes under unchecked, could Israel doctrine evolve into something more aggressive or preemptive?
So there are two things that have happened since October 2023, right? The first is that Israel's military actions in Gaza, as disproportionate as they have enjoyed a large amount of support from global, especially Western capitals, right? As a result of which, Israel has got the opportunity to expand its war, right? If you wish to talk of Iran's proxy footprint in the region, there are four main groups, right? You have Hezbollah in Lebanon, you have Hamas in Gaza, which has a different profile and a different relationship with Iran, but just for the sake of the conversation. You have the Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq, and you have the Houthis in Yemen, right? Each of these forces, except Hamas, have in the past few years a strong domestic logic of operations. Hezbollah, especially, has faced mounting domestic challenges, right? Economically, politically, and in terms of the space that they occupy in Lebanon's very complicated trilateral political system, right? So you will remember that for the time that Nasrallah was alive during Israel's war on Gaza, Hezbollah never committed itself to a large scale war with Israel as happened, say, in 2006 or in the 80s. But Hezbollah and Israel, their engagement remained limited to exchanges of rocket fire and airstrikes, right? So you had this kind of calibration that was accepted on both sides, right? But in the middle of last year, that also devolved into full scale war, right? Ultimately, you had a situation where Israel was striking territories, it was striking not just Gaza, but also Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and then ultimately Iran directly, right? So, as I said, there are two things that have happened. The first is that as a result of this unchecked, sustained, and relentless Israeli military action, the immediate capabilities of a lot of these groups has been severely weakened, right? They haven't been eliminated, but they have been weakened. As a result of the first, you have the second aspect here, which is Israel's need to continue sustaining this military logic, right, in all of these states, without necessarily having a political North Star, which you can then use as a yardstick to say that, all right, now Israel has met this goal, and as a result of this, it will stop. Or at least we will go into a post conflict situation where you can talk of reconstruction, rebuilding, or post conflict justice, things like that, right? But that will not happen. In fact, a core division within Israel in the last 16 odd months has been between the military establishment and the political establishment. That by no means is a conflict, it is only a difference in opinion because the IDF, especially in Gaza, has long had questions over its long term goals and objectives in the region, right? But given the way that the Netanyahu government, as well as his far right allies, have worked in the last 16 months, it's evidently clear that it's a futile exercise to search for a specific political objective that the Israelis might have, whether in Syria or otherwise. As I said today, because the Israelis are firm in their belief that the Israeli military action is the only thing that will guarantee Israeli security, you do not have room for any other options or any negotiations with other actors that might propose alternative approaches to you because that will demand good faith. Just a small tidbit. In February, before fighting happened in coastal Syria with the Alawites, before fighting broke out with the Druze in Suwayda and the Bedouins, before even the agreement with the Kurds in March, in Damascus, Ahmed al Shara convened something called the National Dialogue Conference. Right, this was a crucial event because it brought in stakeholders from all parts of Syria to talk of consolidation and unity and to chart a course for Syria's future. As that conference was progressing, Israel ramped up its airstrikes in southern Syria, and Netanyahu delivered a recorded message where he explicitly says that Israel will not allow any forces of this new Syrian government to operate south of Damascus. So essentially asking for a demilitarized Syria. Similarly, Israel is constantly asking for a complete removal of Hamas from Gaza, right? Similarly, in Iran, Israel is also asking for a complete dismantlement and a Libya style agreement in Iran, where Iran's nuclear capabilities are completely removed. In Lebanon, Israel constantly asserts that Hezbollah needs to be completely removed, except that Hezbollah is a little more capable compared to a lot of these other actors. But what is the trend that you see here? That Israel sets maximalist and absolute strategic objectives. Any operational art that you can apply militarily or any tactics that you can observe that the Israeli military seems to be applying is highly improbable, if not impossible, in unilaterally meeting that objective. We've seen that in Iran. We are seeing that in Gaza, as a result of which we're still talking of that issue. And now you see that in Syria. Calling for a complete demilitarization of southern Syria is a direct hammering of the new Syria's sovereignty, right? Which the Syrians believe they have fought very hard for, and as a result of which they've been able to remove a 46-year-old dictatorship, right? However, if you now have an external state that undermines, and undermines is a very mild term, completely undermines that sovereignty, that for them is unacceptable. But the last point here is that thus far, Ahmed al Sharra, despite being a former Al Qaeda jihadist, has not made any commitment to take on Israel. It's another matter that they cannot, because Israel today is a predominant power in the Middle East, right? But even if you remove capabilities and talk only of intention, Sharra is not interested in fighting Israel or any other state. For them, the local issue, the local threat within Syria remains Iran, right? But with the Arabs as well as the Turks, he wants to make sure that Syria today is also successful in using the Arabs to lobby Washington to rein in Israel because of their immediate objective, failing which there is a risk of a broken windows effect, right? Because of which Iran can sort of re enter through many, many routes. But again, that's a larger conversation. But that's where the difference in priorities lie. And I think that's the best way to explain the Israeli approach.
All right. So, as we are talking about Israel and Syria, it's important to discuss Lebanon here. Across Israel's northern frontier, tensions with Hezbollah is reaching a new level, especially after Gaza war. So, are we seeing a strategic recalibration in Hezbollah's posture? And if so, what does that mean for Israel's security doctrine in the north? Could the Israeli military now face two-front reality, forcing it to rethink its entire deterrence framework?
I think the rethinking today has to be done by groups like Hezbollah. But since we're focusing on Hezbollah, I'll talk only about it. The reason I say that is because last year, Israel pulled off a number of military operations that are unprecedented, even for the history that Israel and Hezbollah themselves share, right? And it's a long history that goes back to the 1980s, right? Israel has occupied South Lebanon for a long period historically, and Hezbollah's raison d'etre, if so to speak, has always been the ejection of Israeli forces and Israeli influence from South Lebanon, right? Because of that, Hezbollah has always made a sovereignty-based argument for its existence within Lebanon, and they have been so successful that for the longest time, Hezbollah has also enjoyed support from not just the Shias, but the Sunnis, the Christians, as well as a lot of other ethnic groups in Lebanon. But in the last few years, even before the conflict started in Gaza, Hezbollah was facing increasing popular dissent, especially because of its mishandling of the Lebanese economy. Hezbollah was sought to be held accountable because, well, Hezbollah is a formal part of the Lebanese government, right? And has representation in the Lebanese parliament, right? You will remember that in the last 5 years, there have been larger and larger protests in Lebanon against the way that the country has been run. Hezbollah was largely successful in repositioning itself within Lebanon and engaging with dialogue with a lot of parties. But then you had the significant port explosion in Beirut, if you remember. Again, that brought back questions over the security of Hezbollah's arms caches, over the role that it plays within the country, over the threat that Hezbollah's existence itself brings to Lebanon. especially from countries like Israel. So there was an ongoing debate, right? In the middle of that, you had Israel's war in Gaza, and that war has been prolonged. And eventually, you had a fresh front that opened with Israel in the middle of the Gaza war. But as I mentioned earlier, Hezbollah largely stood down, or rather stood by. Right? But finally, when the war took place, it became clear that Israel was again unsuccessful in completely eliminating Hezbollah, but only successful in sort of pushing them north of the Litani River in Lebanon. Right? But they achieved one thing, which is the complete removal. I wouldn't even call it a decimation, a removal of of Hezbollah's senior leadership, right? And that included Hassan Nasrallah. It's crucial to remember that Hassan Nasrallah, along with individuals like Major General Qasem Soleimani, in the last 15 years, had been instrumental in convincing Ayatollah Khamenei of Tehran to intervene more and more in a lot of these other countries, right? So when it comes to the Israeli approach, Netanyahu really presented that as a significant success, and it worked because until then, a constant surveys within Israel showed that Netanyahu was not that popular a leader anymore. Right? In fact, his whole image as Mr. Security was dented after the October 7th terror attacks. Right? But those began to very incrementally rebound. Right? After a ceasefire was brokered in Lebanon late last year, that ceasefire has largely been observed only by one side, which is Hezbollah, and not because they wish to observe it in good faith, but because of the decimation that has been reached, not just in terms of their organizational capabilities, but also a lot of their arms and ammunition that they presently only again present a threat in being for Israel, right? Whereas what Israel has done has constantly breached that ceasefire and go after Hezbollah targets whenever it deems it to be tactically useful and tactically convenient. Because for them, this is a threat which, as I said, is down but not out. Even if Israel can't ensure that it is out, Israel needs to ensure that it is down, right? So, given that logic, again, you have a perpetual conflict, right, which continues as we speak. And this is the new template. So, the real question today is the way in which Hezbollah, which has been weakened domestically, has been severely weakened militarily by Israel, has had its roots cut, its principal supply routes to Iran cut off in Syria. Will this group again manage to reconsolidate and unify in such a way that the removal of its senior leadership, which represented their main institutional memory, can be replaced successfully? If that happens, then you can say that it'll be Israel that has to recalibrate its approach. So far, the Israelis have recalibrated and they've been successful, right? So the ball really is in Hezbollah's court. For the Israelis today, Lebanon is back to being a late 2023, early 2024 front where you keep up attacks based on intelligence inputs, right? It is Gaza where the fighting really continues. And even using the word fighting is a misnomer because it's only one side that's dominating militarily, but nonetheless.
Let's shift our focus to trade corridors. The India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, also named as IMEC, is being marketed as rival to China's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. But can IMEC realistically bypass the traditional checkpoints like Egypt? And in your viewpoint, is this the dawn of new regional integration, or is it just another geopolitically driven pipe dream?
So I think it's important to state that when the IMEC was conceptualized in September 2023, the Middle East was in a different world entirely, right? As so far we've been discussing, it's been rather clear. Once the October 2023 attacks happened and the conflict began and brought us to where we are today, it has become practically impossible to push work or rather have progress on the ground vis a vis IMEC as things stand today. However, it does not by any means imply that the concept, or rather the fundamental economic logic that brought IMEC into being in the first place, is removed. That very much still exists, right? The IMEC logic, and it by no means was only an Indian effort, right? It relies rather even more on Emirati support, on Saudi support, on Jordanian support, on Israeli support, and then eventually European support, right? But today, you have a situation where even if you for momentarily assume that the conflict has been resolved, the IMEC's original idea was to help in that reintegration and increase Israel's incentives to also then push for a resolution of the Israel-Palestine question by taking care of a lot of Israel's economic needs, right? Especially a labor substitution, right? But today, when it comes to the root of the IMEC, as you said, there are other rival choke point economies, right? You have Egypt, you have Turkey, and potentially you have Iran, right? Objectively, at the surface and technically, all three of these states would be on paper opposed to the IMEC, right? But all three of these states have chosen very different approaches to engage the IMEC, right? The Egyptians have chosen a conciliatory approach, right? They are questioning the IMEC's inherent logic because, well, it bypasses the Suez Canal, but they are not fighting it. What they're pushing for is to supplement the IMEX corridor with the route that already exists through the Suez, and to make sure that Egypt can potentially integrate itself with the IMEC, which as a concept completely works. Right? Those conversations are ongoing. So the Egyptians are not hostile; they're only concerned economically. The Turks, on the other hand, are completely hostile. And this Erdogan has made very, very clear because intellectually, Turkey has always served as a bridge between Asia and Europe. So IMEC, in some ways, looks to undo that bridge, right? By going from Asia through Jordan and through Israel into Europe, right? Through Greece, Italy, and other ports. So the Turks have been very hostile to this. The Turks also have an independent east to west corridor that runs through Iraq. And the Turkish interest has never come to a middle ground where you can bring them into the circle that Egypt exists in today, which is a conciliation and potential engagement with the IMEC, right? The Iranians, on the other hand, are neither looking to substantially engage with the project nor are they fully hostile to the project, right? But I would say they are rather indifferent to it because compared to both of these two other states, the Iranians have independent connectivity projects with Iran, with India in any case, right? And a principal component of these projects is also the Chabahar port, which India and Iran are developing together. So the Iranians, while they complain about it, they are not hostile to Indian progress on the IMEC, right? So I think that's where all of these three states are situated. But finally, when it comes to implementing it on the ground, it is that one connecting piece of the puzzle which is missing today. And as the days, I'd rather say, as the hours go by, that seems bleaker and bleaker, which is the connection between Jordan and Israel. The longer that this conflict in Gaza runs and the more devastation that Israel wages in Gaza and the larger region, the more insecurity in the long term that the region faces, and the less likely a chance that that crucial connection will be so safe, secure, and sustainable that you will have companies that are ready to invest. I mean, it's a very old business saying that you don't put good money after bad, right? So, in this case, if you can ensure that that crucial connecting link can be protected and that you can incentivize the Israelis to stop the genocide in Gaza, come to the table, agree to a Palestinian state, then only that can ensure long term success. But that having been said, as we speak, just tomorrow, we are set to have a conference on the IMEC in New Delhi with participation from the Arab states as well as the Americans to discuss pathways forward, right? Now, one could speculate and say this is also potentially to bring Israel back to the table and push it more towards concessions, at least in the long term, towards a Palestinian state. But the second part is entirely unlikely. But I brought this up merely to supplement the argument that the IMEC as a concept remains alive. Because a lot of work today is happening, but in the India Middle East section of the corridor. It's the Europe section of the corridor where the main questions lie because of the connecting link between the Middle East and Europe, right? So today, India, Saudi Arabia, and UAE are making good progress towards operationalizing the corridor. But if you look at the grander project, it would, even in September 2023, take a long time. But given how the conflict is progressing, given how other states are positioned, I think the time period for implementing the project is far longer than was initially anticipated.
So let's come to the final question, and very important one, I guess. What does the future regional order looks like? And my question to you is in two sections. First, that if we see the bigger picture, will the United States retrench or reassert itself in the region? And secondly, and that's more important, that can the Middle East escape the vicious cycle of proxy wars?
Right. So, two parts to that question, and I think I'll answer in parts as well. The first one being the United States' role in the Middle East. Historically, especially in the last 2 decades, the one aspect that has set the United States apart from other countries like China is the US commitment and willingness to invest in military resources and a military presence in the region to guarantee regional security. Right? That is the key distinction with states such as China, which has economically made huge inroads in the Middle East. In fact, a lot of these states which are geopolitically rival with each other are all part of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? However, under the Trump administration, in the first term especially, we saw a push for America first as a large national objective, especially for foreign policy. A downstream impact of that was a reduction and potential withdrawal of the American military presence in the region, right? The first Trump administration did not succeed by any measure in really doing that because they faced a lot of pushback from even within US organizations like the State Department. If you take Syria as an example, in Syria, the United States' Kurdish partners like the SDF, with whom we started this conversation, were very, very instrumental in defeating the Islamic State. Because Washington now wished to withdraw military support, the Kurds pushed back. The State Department successfully lobbied Washington to delay that withdrawal. A similar story in Iraq and the rest of the region, right? Now, however, the United States is almost doubling down on its demand that regional security is a responsibility for regional states, right? That is the second Trump administration's driving objective. Compared to the first Trump term, I would say today, and this links to the second question as well, Arab states in the region, especially the Gulf Arabs, are very, very interested in doing so because they have also realized that a key instrument of engagement with the United States today is transactions, right? As a result of which, if that economic relationship can be leveraged, then the Arabs can very well take care of the region's security, right? You will remember, as an aside, when Trump made a very crass comment about turning Gaza into a Riviera, the Arabs responded with a plan of their own, right? They didn't dismiss the US plan. They simply said, and it was Egyptian led, they simply said that we can do this ourselves, right? The United States likes this, the Arab states likes this, so it's very easy for them to reach a middle ground. The second Trump administration, his first foreign visit was to the Middle East, right? To Saudi Arabia, to UAE, and to Qatar. If you look at the deals that were signed, which are in hundreds and hundreds of millions, it shows you that the Arabs know what the US priority is, and vice versa when it comes to Washington. In fact, Trump's deals with Saudi Arabia included a defense deal that exceeded 140 million US dollars, which is the largest in the history of the United States. Right. So it's become very clear that it is economic engagement and economic priorities that is driving the US's approach to the region, or rather, the future of US presence in the Middle East, right? But, and rounding off, the second component to your question is beyond the economy. What is the geopolitical logic which the Arab states are trying to fit with the economic logic, right? I think the best thing to do here is to quote the person that comes to mind, which is Wali Nasser from the United States, who perhaps put it best, which is that the Middle East today, I think, represents Bismarckian Europe, right? Where you have multiple centers of power. You have Turkey, you have Israel, you have each of the Arab states, and you have Iran, right? But the primary interest for all of these centers of power is to balance against any one power that seems to be rising unbridled and unchecked, right? For them, that power has usually been Iran because of Iran's disruptive abilities in the region through its proxies and directly, right? But today, that power has been weakened. But on the other hand, you have another power which is rising as another center of gravity that might become predominant, which is Israel. So, just like with Iran, their interest is to equalize things, right? Which is why the reference to Bismarck in Europe. And if this effort can be supplemented economically through direct transactions with Washington, and politically by succeeding in lobbying the United States to increase or rather push the objective that all of the Arab states are collectively looking to achieve in the region with Israel, right? If all of that falls into place, then the Arab picture for the future of the Middle East is very clear, that you have an inclusive region which is very, very well connected within, is less reliant on the United States for military support and security, and that the major fault lines which have broken out into conflict so many times are resolved for good, right? Maybe you can make the argument that just like how Israel has an absolutist objective for its military approach, the Arabs also have an absolutist objective. However, their approach is economic, it's diplomacy, and it's through mediation and negotiation. So far, we see neither side go anywhere, right? So that's where we are stuck today in the Middle East. The future of the Middle East will depend on which side really succeeds in reordering, the region in the future. If Israel succeeds in showing that its military strikes can ensure regional security, then the future of the Middle East is Israeli. And if the Arabs can succeed in lobbying the United States for Israel to tone down its military approach and say that economic engagement, including and not without Israel, is the future, then maybe you could make the argument, especially since the Iranians also agree with this, that economic prosperity is something that the Middle East might go towards, right? Because I'll finish with this, that the Iranians are also very, very interested today in doing business with the Arabs and the Americans, right? But it's because, again, you have one core component in the region, which is Israel, which is completely focused on distinguishing its unilateral approach from those of the other states. That hindrance remains, right? I think that's where the Middle East is today.
So with this, we are going to conclude our discussion. One thing is clear. Middle East is no longer anyone's exclusive backyard. It's everyone's chessboard. Thank you so much, Bashir, for your time and for excellent analysis on the Middle East.
Thanks, Afeera. It was a great conversation.
Also, thank you for watching Chaos Knowledge. If you like our content, make sure to like, subscribe, share, and leave us a comment. Until next time, take care.